A mother and her kids, cast out into a freezing night with no hope, until a stranger appears, hiding a secret that could save them or destroy them. The wind sliced through the air like a jagged knife, ripping at Celine Carver's thin, tattered dress as she trudged along the frozen dirt path. Her two children clung to her sides, their small, cold hands gripping the edges of her skirt as if it were their only lifeline. Remy, her 8-year-old son, walked with his head up, trying to look brave, his little jaw clenched tight. But his shaking fingers betrayed him, trembling against the fabric. Isla, just 7, had sobbed herself silent hours ago. Her pale face, framed by tangled golden curls, looked lifeless in the fading light. Her lips, once soft and pink like a flower, were now cracked and turning a sickly purple from the cold. Behind them, the dark, looming shape of the farmhouse stood like a silent giant. The home Celine had known since marrying Grayson all those years ago. Now, it was a hollow shell, filled with the icy, judgmental stares of her husband's family. They'd welcomed her once, shared meals and laughter, called her their own. But the second Grayson's heart stopped beating, their warmth turned to ash. She had no right to their house, they said, no claim to their food, their firewood, or even a corner to sleep in. A widow was a burden, they sneered, and 2 hungry kids made it worse. The barn door had slammed shut behind them with a loud, final bang, the sound rolling across the empty, snow-dusted fields. Snowflakes swirled around their feet as Celine pushed forward, her boots so worn they barely held together. She didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stop, not now, not ever. The sky stretched above them, a dull, heavy gray that promised more snow, more cold, more trouble. Bare trees lined the narrow trail ahead, their twisted branches swaying in the wind like the fingers of some unseen spirit reaching out to grab them. Celine pulled Isla tighter against her chest, her arms aching as the wind battered them with every step. It felt like a battle, not just against the weather, but against the ground itself, as if the earth had joined her in-laws in wanting her gone, buried, forgotten. Remy walked beside her, quiet as a shadow, his cheeks red and raw from the wind's bite, his small fists clenched so tight they'd turned pink. He hadn't said a word since they'd been thrown out, not even when his aunt, with a cold glare, yanked the blanket off his shoulders and shoved them out into the night. Then, out of nowhere, his rough little voice cut through the silence. "I can carry her," he said, his eyes flicking to Isla. "You're tired, Mama." Celine's heart twisted hard in her chest. He was just a boy, too small, too young to be offering this, too young to be anything but safe and warm by a fire. She managed a weak smile, her lips chapped and sore. "I'm okay, love. Just stay close to me." The path curved ahead, twisting out of sight as it dipped into a thick line of trees. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, too quiet, almost suffocating. All Celine could hear was the crunch of frost under their boots and the shallow, wheezing sound of their breathing. By noon, their legs burned with every step, and their stomachs growled loud enough to echo in the stillness. Celine tried to push the hunger out of her mind, but it clawed at her insides, sharp and relentless. Their last bite of food had been 2 days ago, just a dry, stale scrap of bread tossed at them like they were stray dogs before the farmhouse door locked tight. Isla let out a soft, pitiful whine, her head lolling against Celine's shoulder. Celine pressed her lips to the girl's forehead, too cold, too fragile, and whispered, "Not much farther now," though she had no clue if it was true. Remy tripped over a root hidden under the snow, catching himself just before he fell. He wiped his face with a quick, angry swipe, his teeth gritted. Celine swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice hoarse. "We'll rest soon, I promise. We'll find some cover." But where? The land rolled on forever around them, blanketed in white, endless and unforgiving. The trees tower high, their branches bare and useless against the wind that sank deep into their bones. A crow screeched somewhere far off, its cry sharp and lonely. Remy tugged at her sleeve, his voice urgent. "Mama, look there." She followed his gaze, squinting through the swirling snow. Past the next hill, half hidden by a cluster of trees, stood a small, weathered building, a trading post, old and sagging. A tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest, weak but alive. With renewed strength, they stumbled toward it, their feet dragging through the snow. The wood was warped and gray, beaten down by years of storms, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. Celine steadied herself, her breath puffing out in white clouds, and shoved the door with her shoulder. It creaked loud and slow before swinging open. Inside, the air was thick and musty, heavy with the smell of dust and rotting wood. Shelves lined the walls, most of them bare, though a few broken crates and bits of junk were scattered across the floor. In the corner sat a fireplace, cold and dark, but still solid, still whole. Celine lowered Isla to the ground gently, her arms shaking from the effort, and wrapped the girl in the thin, frayed cloth she'd carried from the farmhouse. Remy was already poking through the clutter, his small hands sifting through the mess. "Anything?" she asked, her voice low and rough. "Not much," he said, holding up a cracked glass bottle and a small pile of dry beans. "Hard and old, but something." She nodded, her throat tight. It wasn't much, but it'd have to do. She turned to the fireplace, her hands trembling as she knelt in front of it. If she could get a fire going, they might survive the night. She dug into her pocket and pulled out the flint she'd swiped from the farmhouse before they were kicked out. Her last piece of luck. Her fingers, stiff and numb from the cold, fumbled with it. The first strike sparked a tiny flash of light, but the wood was damp and stubborn. She tried again, her breath hitching. Nothing. Panic started to chew at her chest, sharp and cold. She struck harder, desperate. A spark caught this time, flickering weakly, sending up a thin wisp of smoke before fading out. Her stomach dropped. She couldn't fail them now. Not here, not like this. She hit the flint again, harder, her knuckles white. Finally, a glow held. A small, fragile flame licked at the wood. She let out a shaky breath, cupping her hands around it to shield it from the draft, coaxing it bigger. Slowly, the fire spread, crackling as it took hold. Warmth crept into the room, faint at first, then stronger, pushing back the chill. Isla stirred, scooting closer to the light, her eyes half open. Remy sat beside her, hugging his knees to his chest, his face still tight with worry. For the first time in hours, Celine let her shoulders sag, let herself breathe. They weren't safe yet, but they were alive. Outside, the wind screamed like a wild animal, rattling the walls of the old building. The wood groaned and creaked under the pressure, as if it might give up at any moment. Then a sound. Something shifted in the shadows beyond the fire's glow. Celine froze, her breath catching in her throat. A low growl rumbled through the air, deep and close. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Remy went rigid beside her, his wide eyes darting to the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, nearer. Celine's hand shot to the floor, grabbing a rusty knife she'd spotted earlier among the junk. She gripped it tight, her knuckles aching. Her body screamed at her to run, to get her kids and flee, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from this crumbling shack in the middle of nowhere. The door, still cracked open from when they'd come in, shook in the wind. A shadow moved past the gap, low, sleek, not human. A wolf. Celine clapped her free hand over Isla's mouth as the girl whimpered, keeping her still. Remy's breathing was fast and shallow, his gaze locked on the doorway. The wolf's snout appeared, sniffing the air, its breath steaming in the cold. Another gust rocked the building, and the beast took a step closer, its paws crunching on the snowy ground outside. Celine's grip on the knife tightened until her hand hurt. If it came inside, if it lunged, she'd fight. She'd have to. The wolf let out a deep, rumbling snarl, its eyes flashing yellow in the firelight. Its thick fur was matted with frost, its body tense and ready. It took another step, its head lowering. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and slipped back into the black night. The silence that followed was deafening. Celine's hands shook as she lowered the knife, her chest heaving. Remy swallowed hard, his voice a whisper. "Do you think it'll come back?" "I don't know," she said, her voice raw with truth. They didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, throwing flickering shadows across the walls that danced like ghosts. The wind never stopped its howling, and Celine couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was waiting out there, watching them. Dawn crept over the horizon, slow and weak, painting the sky in soft golds and purples. Exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy coat, pressing her down. Then, a new shadow fell across the doorway. Tall, solid, unmoving, a figure stood there, staring at them. Her breath caught in her throat. Not a wolf, not a thief, something else entirely. Who was this? What did he want? Her tired mind raced. Everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure she could handle it. The stranger stayed still, his face shrouded in the faint morning light. Celine's heart thudded against her ribs as she pulled Isla closer, her arms trembling. Remy pressed tight against her side, his fingers digging in her dress, his breathing quick and uneven. The man was big, broad-shouldered, wrapped in thick furs that carried the faint smell of dirt and smoke. His long, dark hair was tied back, resting against his chest, and his eyes, sharp and steady, watched them with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. A bow hung over his shoulder, a knife glinted at his hip. He could kill them if he wanted, she thought. No fight, no chance to run. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, pressing down on her. Then, slowly, he reached into his furs and pulled out a small bundle. He took one careful step forward, set on the ground between them, and stepped back. Celine's body tensed, every muscle tight with suspicion. What was this? A trap? A trick? The bundle sat there, wrapped in rough, dirty cloth, taunting her with its mystery. Remy shifted beside her. "What is it?" he whispered, barely audible. She didn't answer, couldn't. Keeping her eyes locked on the man, she edged forward, her shaky fingers reaching out. She peeled back the cloth, slow and cautious. Inside was dried meat, a small flask of water. A gift. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and looked up at him. He stared back, his face blank, giving nothing away. Was this kindness, or something darker? She waited, breath held, for him to speak, to demand something, a price, a trade, a threat. Nothing came. She'd learned long ago that kindness always had a catch, a hidden cost that cut deeper than any blade. But his eyes held no malice, no mockery, just a strange, steady calm. "Thank you," she said, her voice small and cracked. He didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't even seem to hear her. Instead, he turned and stepped toward the door, his boots silent on the creaky floor, like he'd finished whatever he'd come to do. "Wait," she blurted, the word escaping before she could stop it. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder, his expression still unreadable. Her throat tightened, questions piling up inside her. Why help them? Why this gift? What did he want? But they wouldn't come out. She just gripped the food tighter, her fingers digging into it as if it might vanish the moment he did. He gave a single, slow nod, then slipped out into the morning mist, disappearing as quietly as he'd come. She didn't see him again for 2 long days. The meat and water lasted longer than she'd dared hope, split carefully between the 3 of them. Isla's cheeks grew a little less hollow, her eyes a little brighter. Remy ate in silence, his gaze flicking to the door every few minutes, waiting, watching. Celine told herself not to hope. Hope was a liar, a thief that stole more than it gave. But then he returned. This time, he didn't hesitate, walked straight through the door, the wind howling behind him, carrying the sharp sting of coming snow. She straightened, forcing her voice not to waver. "Who are you?" He glanced at her, then at the fire, like he was deciding whether to answer. Finally, his voice broke the stillness, low and rough like gravel. "Rowan." The name hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, settling into the cracks of the room. He crouched by the fire, holding his hands to the weak flames, his movements slow and deliberate. Remy watched him, curiosity warring with caution in his tired eyes. Rowan's gaze slid to the boy. "You're strong," he said, simple and sure. Remy blinked, caught off guard, then nodded, sitting up a bit straighter. Celine pressed harder. "Why are you helping us?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a bundle of animal skins, soft, thick, warm. Without a word, he handed them to her. She hesitated, her hands hovering, then took them, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. "You need these," she said, her voice unsteady. "No," he replied, firm and final, no hint of expecting anything back. She clutched the furs tighter, confusion swirling in her chest. "I don't understand. You don't even know us." His eyes flicked to the fire, shadows dancing across his face. "I know hunger." The words landed like stones, heavy with meaning she couldn't fully grasp. Who was he? What had he seen to speak like that? The silence settled again, but it felt different now, less sharp, less choking. When Rowan stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder, Celine spoke before she could stop herself. "Where are you going?" "Hunting," he said, meeting her gaze with that same steady look. "Will you come back?" A quiet moment passed. Then he nodded once, firm and sure. Remy's lips twitched into a small, fleeting smile, the first in days. Rowan returned that evening, carrying a rabbit, skinned, gutted, its meat fresh and pink. He handed it to Celine without a word. watching as she stared at it, stunned into silence. That night, they ate well, the taste of warm food filling the empty spaces inside them. Days stretched into nights, and the snow outside grew thicker, blanketing the world in endless white. Rowan came every evening at first, his presence a steady anchor in their fragile shelter. But as winter tightened its grip, he stayed longer, lingering past dusk. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His actions carried weight. He showed Remy how to make traps, his hands patient as he guided the boy's fingers over the knots. He brought firewood, stacking it high against the wall, enough to last them days. One evening, as Celine struggled to sew a torn piece of cloth with numb, clumsy fingers, Rowan took the needle from her without a word and finished it himself, his stitches neat and quick. What drove him? What kept him here? Isla took to him fast, sitting close as he sharpened his knife by the fire, her big eyes following his hands with quiet wonder. He led her, never brushing her off, never snapping. Remy followed him too, copying his every move, how he walked, how he checked the traps, eager to learn, hungry for something solid to hold on to. Celine watched it all, her fears softening into something she couldn't name, something warm and unfamiliar. One night, the fire popped and hissed between them as Rowan looked at her across the flames. "Winter's going to get worse," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her throat tight. "It always does." His eyes held hers, steady and piercing. "You can't stay here." Her stomach twisted. "I've got nowhere else to go." A long pause hung between them, thick with unspoken things. "Come with me," he said finally. The words hit her like a gust of wind, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at him, searching his face for a lie, a trick, a hidden catch. But there was nothing, just quiet certainty. "You don't know me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know enough." She glanced at her kids, Isla curled up under the furs, her breathing soft and even. Remy sitting beside Rowan, his hands rougher now, his eyes carrying a weight no child should bear. Could she risk this? The wind howled outside, the fire dimmed to embers, and deep in her chest, Celine felt something stir. Hope, fragile and daring, reaching for light. The journey from the trading post was slow and grueling, each step pulling them deeper into the wild unknown. Snow crunched under Celine's boots, heavy and wet, dragging at her legs. Remy stayed close to Rowan, matching his careful, silent steps, while Isla rode on the man's back, her tiny hands clutching the thick furs draped over his shoulders. Celine hung back a little, her eyes fixed on him. His quiet strength unsettled her. How could someone so big move so silently, so sure? He'd given her no reason to fear him. Not yet, but fear had been her shadow for so long it wouldn't let go. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth through the air. The trees grew denser, their tall, skeletal shapes blocking out the gray sky above. The deeper they went, the more Celine realized how lost she'd have been without Rowan leading the way. There were no trails here, no markers, just endless snow and the forest low, whispering hum. By nightfall, they stopped under a rocky ledge where the wind couldn't reach as hard. Rowan worked fast, gathering sticks and striking flint to steel until sparks flew. Celine pulled the furs tighter around Isla, watching as Remy leaned in close while Rowan showed him how to stack the wood just right, small pieces first, then bigger ones, feeding the fire slow so it burned steady and long. She wanted to say something, to thank him, but the words felt strange and heavy in her mouth. Instead, she busied herself with the little food they had left. The dried meat he'd given them days ago was nearly gone, but Rowan had brought fresh game, skinned and cleaned with care. As the smell of roasting meat filled the air, Celine felt a flicker of relief, small but real, warming her from the inside. Isla warmed to Rowan faster than Celine had expected. She sat beside him, her small hands playing with the edge of his coat, tracing the beads sewn into the leather with quiet fascination. He didn't mind, didn't push her away. Even when she shivered, he pulled part of his cloak around her without a word, tucking it over her shoulders. Remy was different. He didn't just watch. He wanted to prove himself. He studied Rowan's every move, from how he tied a knot to how he sliced meat with his knife, steady and precise. He didn't ask questions, just absorb it all, his young face set with determination. Celine found herself watching too, caught by the calm way Rowan moved, the patience in his hands. That night, as the firelight threw long, shifting shadows against the trees. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. "My winter camp," he said, not looking up from his work. "How far?" "2 days." Her stomach nodded at the thought of 2 more days trudging through this frozen wilderness, but she forced herself to nod. Isla had already fallen asleep, curled up under the blankets, her breathing soft and steady. Remy sat by the fire, his eyes drooping but stubborn. "Sleep," she murmured to him, brushing a hand over his hair. He shook his head, jaw tight. "I'm not tired." Rowan glanced over. "Rest is strength," he said, his tone even. Remy paused, then nodded slowly, lying down beside Isla. Celine waited until his breathing slowed, deep and calm, before letting her own shoulders relax. The night was still, save for the fire's crackle and the faint hoot of an owl in the distance. She felt Rowan's steady gaze on her, heavy and quiet. "You don't trust me," he said at last, his voice blunt but not harsh. She stiffened, caught off guard. "I don't trust anyone," she admitted, her words sharp with truth. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't read. Understanding, maybe. "Wise," he said simply. She frowned, confused. "Then why help us?" He was quiet for a long moment, like he was weighing whether to let her in. Finally, he sheathed his knife and leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You're alone," he said, his voice low. "I've seen what happens to those left to fend for themselves." What did he mean? What did he live through to say that with such weight? The next day, the journey dragged on, the ground growing rougher under their feet. Celine's legs ached, her breath puffing out in short, white bursts in the frigid air. Rowan moved ahead, clearing branches and snow from their path, his presence a quiet promise of safety she wasn't sure she could lean on yet. By noon, they reached a river, its surface half frozen, jagged chunks of ice breaking where the water ran fast and dark underneath. Rowan stopped, studying it for a long moment, then stepped onto the ice, testing its strength with slow, careful shifts of his weight. Celine's heart thumped loud in her chest. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice tight. He nodded, looking back at her. "Step where I step." She hesitated, fear curling in her gut, then took Remy's hand, her grip firm. Isla whimpered, burying her face in Celine's shoulder as they started across. The ice creaked under their feet, groaning with every move. Celine's stomach churned, the river roaring below like a hungry beast waiting to swallow them. She followed Rowan's path exactly, her eyes locked on his boots. A sharp crack split the air like a gunshot. Her breath stopped. Remy gasped as the ice under his foot splintered, his leg plunging toward the water. Celine lunged, grabbing his arm with a desperate yank, just as Rowan moved, fast as lightning, his hand clamping around Remy's wrist, pulling him back to solid ice before the river could claim him. Remy shook hard, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Rowan crouched in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "Breathe," he said, calm and steady. "You're safe now." Remy swallowed, nodding, his eyes wide. Celine pulled him close, her hands trembling as she hugged him tight. She met Rowan's gaze over Remy's head, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. "Thank you," she whispered, the words raw. They crossed the rest of the river slow and careful, reaching the other side with no more breaks. By the time they stumbled into Rowan's winter camp, Celine's bones ached with exhaustion. The camp was tucked between tall rock formations, shielded from the wind's bite. A small fire pit sat in the center, ringed by simple shelters made of wood and hides, sturdy against the cold. Rowan moved with quiet ease, setting down his pack, checking the area. Remy sank beside the fire pit, staring into the empty space, while Isla curled up next to him, her small body finally giving in to sleep. Celine hesitated before sitting on the furs Rowan laid out for them, her hands brushing the soft warmth. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low but sure. She looked into his eyes, searching for a lie, a crack, and found none. For the first time in months, she let herself believe it. Winter dug its claws deeper into the land, but the camp became their haven, fragile but real. The nights stretched long and bitter, the cold seeping through every crack, but they had shelter, food, and Rowan. Remy grew steadier each day, his quiet softened by a new sureness in his steps. Isla's laugh came back, soft and hesitant at first, then brighter, like a bird testing its wings. Rowan moved through their days like a constant shadow, hunting when their stores ran low, setting traps with a skill that left Celine in awe, stacking wood to keep the fire alive. His hands were always careful, his focus sharp, like the world lived in those small, still moments. He didn't talk much, but she found herself watching him more, trying to piece together the man behind the silence. The man who'd seen hunger, who'd known loss, who stayed when he didn't have to. She noticed the little things he did, making sure Isla's furs were tight around her before he fixed his own, showing Remy how to carve a stick into a rough shape when he thought no one was looking. And sometimes, when their eyes met across the fire, something passed between them. Something unspoken. Something she wasn't ready to touch. What was it? Trust? Something deeper? With every day, the weight of her grief, her anger, her fear began to lighten, replaced by a quiet peace she hadn't thought she'd ever find again. Not after Grayson. Not after everything. One night, as the wind raged outside the shelter, howling like a trapped animal, Rowan spoke of the past, something he'd never done before. It was late, the fire burning low, casting a soft glow over the small space. Isla slept soundly, her head resting against Remy's side, her breathing even. Remy was almost gone too, his hands still wrapped around a small carving he'd been working on. A rough little bear, clumsy but sweet. "You've lost a lot," Rowan said, his voice low but solid, like he'd carried his own losses for years. Celine shifted, uneasy, her eyes fixed on the flames. She'd grown used to the silence between them, but his words tonight cut through it, leaving her exposed. "I have," she said softly, her throat tight. She hadn't spoken of Grayson's death since it happened. Not to her kids, not to anyone. The pain was still there, raw and jagged, a wound she didn't dare touch. But Rowan had seen it somehow, felt it without her saying a word. "Loss is tough," he said, his eyes on the fire. "I know." She nodded, unsure what to say, but his words sank deep, stirring something inside her. She turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time in a while. There was a depth there, a quiet understanding carved from a life of survival and shadows. "I thought I'd never find peace again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the pain would just stay forever." Rowan stayed quiet for a long time, his eyes locked on hers, steady and unflinching. Then slowly he reached out, his rough hand brushing the back of hers. Just a small touch, but it sent a jolt through her, stealing her breath. It was the first time he'd reached for her like that, and it shifted something inside her, something she couldn't name. "You will," he said, his voice soft but sure. "In time. But you have to trust yourself first. And you have to trust others too." Her chest tightened, his words sinking into her like roots. Trust. She'd spent so long building walls, locking everyone out, convinced trust was a weakness that would only break her again. But here, in this tiny shelter, with this man who had no reason to help her, she felt something crack open, something raw, something real. "I don't know if I can trust again," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." Rowan's fingers lingered on hers a moment longer, warm and steady. Then he pulled back slowly, like he could feel her uncertainty. "You are," he said, his tone firm. "Strength isn't just fighting or surviving. It's letting go. It's opening up again, even when it hurts." Celine closed her eyes, his words washing over her like a slow tide. For so long, she'd clung to her grief, her fear, her anger, thinking they'd protect her, keep her safe. But Rowan was right. Strength wasn't just holding on tight. It was knowing when to loosen her grip, when to let someone in. The fire flickered between them, its warmth brushing her skin, but it was the warmth from him she felt most, the quiet promise in his presence. She'd been so afraid of the world, of what might happen if she let her guard down. But now, with Rowan beside her, with her kids safe under the furs, she wondered if she'd been wrong. Maybe there was more to life than fear. Maybe there was space for something else, something like hope. As the night stretched on, she found herself leaning closer to him, drawn by the steady strength he carried, by the soft, unspoken thing in his eyes. And when he looked at her, really looked, there was no pity, no judgment, just understanding, just a quiet acceptance that settled deep in her bones. Days turned into weeks, and with each one, Celine grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. She learned to trust Rowan in ways she'd never thought possible, piece by piece, step by step. She watched him care for her kids with a gentleness that surprised her. Small things, like fixing Isla's blanket when it slipped, or showing Remy how to sharpen a stick into a point with slow, careful strokes. In return, She let him in little by little, her walls crumbling, not all at once, but in quiet, careful moments. One afternoon, as Rowan returned from hunting, the sky dark and heavy with the threat of another storm, Celine sat by the fire, a question burning in her chest. She'd held it for days, waiting for the right moment, and now, with the world still around them, it felt time. "You said I'd find peace," she started, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter inside her. "But what about you? What have you lost?" Rowan paused, his hands stilling over his pack. He looked at her, his gaze deep and searching, reaching into places she hadn't let anyone touch in years. His face softened, just a little, and for the first time he opened a door to his past, of a tribe lost to war, a family taken by time and violence, a life left behind. "I lost them," he said, his voice thick with memory, heavy with years. "But I'm not lost anymore." Celine's heart ached for him, for the quiet pain woven into his words. In that moment, she understood something bigger. Loss didn't have an end, didn't fade clean away, but there was healing in moving forward, strength in rebuilding, hope in letting yourself feel again. As the storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the sky, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames and each other filling the silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Celine let herself believe in a future that could be more than just surviving, a future that might hold light, might hold joy. In Rowan's quiet strength, in his steady patience, she found something she'd thought was gone forever, a chance at redemption, a chance at hope. The wind battered the shelter, the fire crackled low, and Celine felt it deep in her chest. This wasn't the end of her story. It was a beginning.